Well, hi everyone. I've got no idea who's here because obviously I can't see anyone, which is a little bit disconcerting, but I'm going to trust that there are people because it's saying that there are people. So just as a few more people might be joining and maybe finishing making their cup of tea to come and join us, I just thought I'd share just a little bit about what my plan is for today and just a little bit about who I am. So I am involved in producing a radio show and a podcast, which what we do is we host a conversation normally between a Christian and a non-Christian, and we just kind of discuss big issues, big questions. And that's some of the things that we're going to be talking about today, some of those big questions that lots of people have got and how we approach those questions. And we're hopefully going to have sort of 15, 20 minutes at the end for Q&A, I guess, depending on how quickly I talk and how much I ramble off point. But do feel free to write your questions in the little chat function, and either we can sort of try and deal with them as we go, although that might be a bit technologically trying for me, or we can do the questions at the end. The other thing I really want to do is make sure it's not just me talking at you, because there's no point this being interactive if it's just me talking at you. What I really want it to be is as interactive as it can be in this sort of slightly strange online setting. So what I want to do is every few minutes, I want us to kind of pause and reflect on some of the things that we're thinking about. Maybe if you've got a pad or like a pen, not a pen, this is a phone, something you can just jot down notes with, maybe where you feel like God is saying something to you or a question that you might have. And we'll go through, and yeah, like I said, this is sort of fairly loose flowing. So if anyone's got anything that they want to ask throughout it, we could even stop the session and answer it, or it might be that we just sort of have them towards the end. But I do want to make sure that we have those kind of times of reflection and maybe even prayer. And I'll tell you what, I'll just pray to start with. I'm going to sort of trust. Yeah, I've got no idea if everyone's here, but hopefully they all are. And this session's being recorded anyway, so even if anyone joins late, they can sort of scoot back to the beginning. So let's pray before we start, shall we? God, thank you so much that you are so big, so clever, so smart. You have all the answers, even when we don't. And we just commit this session to you and ask that anything that we learn in this session, by your grace, we will use it for good, God, that we will not just keep all this stuff to ourselves, but we'll use it to reach a really broken world. I ask that at the very least, you will draw us closer to you in this session. God, just expand our minds and open our hearts to hear what you've got to say. And we ask all this knowing that you are able to do immeasurably more than we can ever ask or imagine. Amen. Well, I think it's fair to say that we don't have to look very far to see the absolute devastation that the pandemic has caused, not just in terms of physical, the amount of people, that millions of people that have sadly died from this disease, but also the mental health implications of this, the loneliness statistics that we've seen rising at a horrifying rate, the poverty that all of this has ensued of. But actually, I don't know whether you're aware of this, but in the midst of the distress, there has remarkably been a rise in people searching for faith and searching for online church and searching terms like God and things like that. I can share some of that research later if you want. But there's also been stories of people coming to faith in the pandemic. I interviewed a lady just before Christmas who that was very much her story. She had no faith at all, and she became a Christian in the pandemic. And I think that the thing that really struck me overall was the kind of overarching thing that she seemed to really be grasping onto was this hope that she had discovered in finding Jesus. And I'm not in any way saying that the tragedy that we've witnessed globally and often personally in our own lives over the last year can in any way justify the good things that we have seen popping up. But I do think that it's perhaps a little bit like that verse that Joseph says at the end of Genesis 50, where he says, "You intended to harm me, but God intended it for good, to accomplish what's now being done, the saving of many lives." And I do think that actually the church and Christians have an amazing opportunity to share this unshakable hope of the gospel in a world that is so desperately in need of it. And our prayer and our hope is that we will see many lives be saved because of this. So I just say all that at the beginning to say that when we're talking about these big questions, these difficult things, we need to know that we're not doing it in a vacuum. We're speaking to and about people who are hurting, who are desperately in need of that hope of the gospel that we know. So let's talk a little bit about apologetics. I'm sure you all know this, but it's always helpful to be reminded that apologetics, that word comes from the Greek word apologia, which doesn't really have a kind of definitive translation into the English, but it means a defense, a reason, an answer. And it's about kind of, having a defense, a reason, and answer for your faith. So it's kind of about those big questions, the difficult questions that often stop people believing in God. And I'm not for a minute saying that we as Christians have all the answers to these difficult questions. But what I found over the years is often you can't even begin to, some people won't even begin to kind of engage with the gospel on a heart level before you've begun to sort of work with them to unblock some of those head barriers, their objections, their doubts, their big questions. And so that's what I think we're going to try and do a little bit of today. The pandemic has brought up all sorts of questions. Obviously the biggest one's suffering, but also injustice and death and poverty and so many other things that have come up. I don't know whether you've got your Bibles with you or some sort of, sorry, my Bible's in a terrible state, or like an app that might have the Bible on it. But we're going to be looking predominantly at 1 Peter 3, verse 15 and 16 today, which is kind of probably the most famous verse about apologetics. The version that I've got here is the New Living Translation, just because I find that kind of the easiest one. So if it's not quite the same as yours, sorry about that. But this is 1 Peter 3, 15 to 16 in the NLT says, "Worship Christ as Lord of your life. And if someone asks about your hope as a believer, always be ready to explain it. But do this in a gentle and respectful way." I'm just going to read that again. "Worship Christ as Lord of your life. And if someone asks about your hope as a believer, always be ready to explain it. But do this in a gentle and respectful way." So we're just going to work our way through that verse and sort of pick things out as we go. So first of all, worship Christ as Lord of your life. I think this little passage makes it clear that worship has got to be the starting point of evangelism. We share our faith as a response to what God has done in our own life. We can't share our faith unless we're sort of sure of what it is ourselves. And there's a missionary called Father Donovan who says that the work of mission begins with a rediscovery of the gospel by the missionaries themselves. And I love that. The work of the mission begins with a rediscovery of the gospel of the missionaries themselves. I don't know about you, but I have tragically seen so many Christian leaders, and not just leaders, but Christian friends, burn out. And it's vital that we protect ourselves from this. And the way to do that is by prioritizing worship, by prioritizing time with God, getting stuck into his word, praying for each other, whatever that looks like in this pandemic where we can't be physically praying for each other. We've got to be excited about the gospel ourselves before we can begin to share it with others. So one thing that I'd love you to do now, if you just got a few minutes, but it might be something that you jot down and think about later, is just have a think about what God has done in your own life. Why do you believe? And why is it that you want to share that hope with the people around you? So we'll take just a couple of minutes. But yeah, it might be that that's too big a thing to think about now, but you maybe want to think about it in the coming week, over the weekend maybe. So what's God done in your life? Why is it that you believe? And what is it and why do you want to share that hope with the people around you? Like I said, that's probably something you want to think about in greater detail because a minute is definitely not enough time. So worship Christ. And then that verse goes on to say, as Lord of your life. Worship Christ as Lord of your life. C.S. Lewis in The Weight of Glory says, God cannot bless us unless he has us. When we try to keep within us an area that is our own, we try to keep an area of death. Therefore, in love, he claims all. That's pretty sort of stark wording that, if we're keeping an area of ourselves, that's an area of death. But I guess that is a really challenging question, isn't it? Is every part of our life completely surrendered to God? Is he Lord of all of our life? I don't know about you, but I felt like I had really grand New Year's resolutions where I was going to sort of really get stuck into the word and really prioritize my relationship with God. And then we sort of went into this seemingly never ending third lockdown, and all of my sort of well planned out plans just kind of went to pot. But I think it's good to know that actually it's not too late. We're only at the beginning of February. We've still got plenty of time to be thinking about how this year we can be prioritizing our relationship with God, how we can be asking for a fresh anointing of the Holy Spirit, how we can be asking God to take control of our whole life, not just the bits that kind of look neat and tidy and sort of hiding the rest away from him, asking him for new vision, new strength. And I think as well, praying that really brave prayer of Isaiah 6, here I am, take me, send me. So again, I'm not going to get you to do this now because we're sort of pushed for time, but I wonder if through the coming week, it's a good idea for us to really seek God and ask him if there are any areas of our life that aren't completely surrendered. And then we can begin to kind of work through that with him. So worship Christ as Lord of your life. And then it goes on to say, if someone asks. What I think is so interesting about this verse is that it assumes that people are asking us questions. Dietrich Bonhoeffer famously said that your life as a Christian should make non-believers question their disbelief in God. I'm going to say that again because it's an absolute belter. Your life as a Christian should make non-believers question their disbelief in God. Such a challenging question, but does the way that we live, does it point other people to God? Does it make people think? Does it challenge their beliefs, as Bonhoeffer says? I think that's such a challenging question. And it wasn't easy for Bonhoeffer living as a Christian in Nazi Germany. And he lived such a provocative life that it actually ended up with him being executed. And clearly death is probably not a kind of, you know, a viable option for us in the West for professing our faith. But that's not to say that actually, you know, it might be really difficult for you to be a Christian in your context. And I don't want to diminish that. But actually, I think what it comes back to is strengthening our relationship with God. Sort of, again, coming back to that worship Christ as Lord of your life, putting him first. And I think in a generation that often has absolutely no reference point for God, we've got to show them what a life with him looks like. We've got to model that life that Bonhoeffer was talking about, which makes non-believers question their disbelief. But I don't think that means necessarily shoehorning God into every conversation and making it really kind of cringy. And because I think that verse assumes that actually the initiative is coming from them. It says, if someone asks you. And so I think that doesn't mean that we don't initiate conversations. Of course it doesn't. But I think we need to live in a way that causes those questions to come up naturally. You know, so people want to ask why our lives look different, why we seem to have more hope, even in the midst of the chaos that's kind of, you know, all around us. So worship Christ as Lord of your life. If someone asks about your hope as a believer, about our hope as a believer, I think this is such a key bit of the verse. Like, you know, we have seen so many people struggling, both kind of globally, but in our own circles as well, and probably a lot of us are struggling ourselves as well. So this is a really difficult situation, and I think we need to sort of share with people that actually the Christian hope doesn't mean that we are perpetually happy, that we constantly have a smile plastered on our faith. Actually, it's so much deeper than that. It's that absolute assurance that even in the midst of the raging storm, that God is with us, that he won't let us go. That's what our hope is. There was a study that was done recently, which is hardly surprising, but is terrifying. And it says that actually the more someone uses Facebook, the less satisfied they are with their life. And I think this endless comparison of people's carefully edited photos, their exaggerated achievements, their fairy tale relationships that just look like the perfect relationship, that causes us such damage. And it must have, I would imagine, only got worse in the pandemic, where basically our whole lives are now constantly online right now. But actually, as Christians, we have got an amazing opportunity to shine a light on our photoshopped culture. And instead of sort of portraying our perfectly painted exterior, actually to show our whole lives, to be vulnerable with it. But I'm well aware that actually vulnerability is often not a popular characteristic. We tend to want sort of strong, sorted, wise people leading and inspiring us. And I don't know whether you've sort of found the same thing, but often I think when we see people on platforms talking about their vulnerabilities, I think particularly in the church, we see them talking about it from a place of having already dealt with those struggles. So, you know, they talk about their struggles kind of in the past tense. But actually, I think in a world that is really struggling, people don't necessarily want to hear the victory stories. They want to hear that there is hope in the midst of what they're going through now. So I think it's really important that we talk about things in a natural way and in a real way. I don't know whether you have come across the Japanese term kintsugi. We in the UK, and certainly in my house, when we break something, which happens all the time because I am incredibly clumsy, we tend to either do two things. We chuck it away because it's like completely irredeemable and we can't do anything with it, or we slather it in super glue, try and stick it back together and sort of try and cover up the brokenness and pretend that it wasn't broken in the first place. But a lot of the time what they do in Japan is they mix this gold powder with the glue so that actually the brokenness becomes beautiful. I've got a little kintsugi set here so you can see the kind of the gold, and that's what happens in the pottery. And the word kintsugi means golden joinery, and I think actually that's such a beautiful picture of the gospel, that God can bring beauty out of broken things. And so I think actually if we share our weakness, our rough edges, our brokenness with our friends and our family, then it gives them permission to share theirs as well. And so I don't know whether we won't do this now, but maybe make a note of this, whether there's sort of stuff going on in your own life that you might be able to share with a close friend or family, just to show them that actually we're still a work in progress, that God's not finished with us yet, that this isn't the end of the story. So we've got worship Christ as Lord of your life if someone asks about your Christian hope. And then we get to the crux of this verse, always be ready to explain it. But how do we explain our faith when there's so much of it that actually we don't even understand? And I don't know about you, but I've had even more questions than I normally have being raised by the pandemic. Like, how do we share our faith when we're not even really necessarily sure what our own faith is? It says in Acts 17 verse 2, it's talking about Paul. He used the scriptures to reason with them. He explained the prophecies and he proved that the Messiah must suffer and rise from the dead. And then it goes on to say, some of the Jews who listened were persuaded. We all know, don't we, that it was God's words, not Paul's words, that persuaded the Jews. But actually, we need to equip ourselves to be ready, because often these questions, these conversations, these difficult situations will arise when we're least expecting them. I mean, the amount of conversations I've had about God at 2 o'clock in the morning on a hen do or something like that, we've got to be ready for these questions to come up at any point. And obviously, we've sort of already seen that the best way that we can prepare ourselves for this is to be cultivating our own relationship with God. Worship Christ as Lord of your life, because actually the more we worship, the more we become aware of that incredible gospel hope, and the more our lives will hopefully attract people's questions, just because we've got this kind of hope bubbling out of us. But one of the other ways that we can do this is by regularly studying our Bibles. That verse in Acts 17 said Paul used the scriptures to reason with them. We need to know that there is such power in this word. And even if we don't understand everything, like, there is such power in it. So, you know, if you don't understand something, like, let's just keep reading it. Let's ask friends who are really wise about it. Let's use some resources. So on that note, actually, hopefully at the end of this session, there's going to be a document. It's quite long, actually. It's like a 4-page document that I've put together of resources, some around the Bible, but lots around sort of specific questions around suffering and injustice and things like that. And there'll be some helpful things on there about sort of specific questions, but I do think there are actually 2 ways that can help to prepare us, whatever the person's question is. And that is to create good relationships, and then to ask and receive questions. So relationships and questions, they're the 2 things that I think can equip us for whatever the discussions are. So the first thing is to create good relationships. Sorry, I speak far too quickly. If I'm speaking too quickly, please do tell me on the chat, because I can see the chat coming in. So yeah, create good relationships. We need to know that actually being ready to explain our Christian hope is not an intellectual exercise, that actually people's fears, their objections, their questions, their doubts, they come from personal wrestling. So relationships, it goes without saying, have got to be at the absolute core of everything we do. And I know this is a really difficult time to be maintaining relationships, and even harder to be sort of initiating relationships, because how do you do that when you can't even see anyone in physical person? But I don't know about you, but I feel like there's people that I have created new relationships with in this lockdown that I'd never really sort of had a relationship with before, like my postman and my neighbours and the dog walkers when I go and walk my little pup, and the local shopkeepers. So actually there are those opportunities, but also sort of, you know, maintaining the relationships that we do have already with our friends and our family. I don't know if you think about how you came to faith. I don't know whether there was a kind of a person involved or people involved, but I'm not sure that people come to faith without people, if that makes sense. So I don't think people really they don't suddenly go from not believing in God to believing in God because of a powerful talk or an interesting video or a particularly compelling book. Those things might be like the penny drop moment that kind of clinches it for them. But my hunch is, I might be wrong about this, my hunch is that often there are people or a person sort of working in the background, praying for that person and sort of gently talking them through things, and then sort of leading them to that place where they make that commitment. And so relationships have got to be at the heart of when we're doing evangelism, creating those good relationships. And it goes without saying as well, of course, that prayer has got to underpin those relationships. I interviewed a guy recently who is called Jim, and he became a Christian at university, and then he lost his faith and became an ardent atheist for like 10 years, and then he has just recently refound his faith again. It's an amazing story. If you want to hear his full story, do check out our Christmas special. So Christmas Unbelievable, if you just Google Christmas Unbelievable, it will come up. He's called Jim. But he said that there's obviously loads of people praying for him in those 10 years when he lost his faith. But there was one guy in particular called Phil, who he'd been good friends with at university when he was a Christian, but he kind of lost touch with him over the years. And Phil got in touch with Jim fairly recently, just to say basically that he had been woken up in the middle of the night by a dream about Jim, and he'd felt really sort of convicted to pray for Jim. And that from that moment, he basically had been praying for Jim every single day. And they worked out afterwards, once Jim had become a Christian, they worked out that actually the moment that Phil had that dream and started to pray for Jim every single day was the moment that Jim began to reconsider his faith. So do not underestimate the power of your prayer. And just remember that actually the most important way that we can be ready to give an answer for what we believe is by investing in those relationships, by remembering that what we're dealing with is people, not projects. We're dealing with people, not projects. And it's only out of those relationships that we can begin to then answer those questions and ask those questions. So what I'd love you to do now, and again, this is something that you can do sort of throughout the week, but maybe start it now, is just have a think about whether there is someone or a few people that you can be thinking of and praying for over the next few weeks and months and possibly years, because sometimes it is years, and really sort of intentionally praying for them and committing to investing in those relationships. So let's just take a minute now to jot down some names and ask God to put some people on your heart. Sorry, I feel like I'm sort of just cutting into you as soon as you're doing anything interactive. But let's really be thinking about that. Let's think about how, maybe we would have that amazing opportunity of being Phil to our Jim, to being that person who's sort of committed to praying. Obviously, we know it's God and it's not us, but actually what an amazing privilege that we get to share in that. So we can be ready by creating amazing relationships, and we can also be ready by both asking and receiving questions. So let's have a look first at asking questions. This might seem counterintuitive if someone's sort of asking you questions or got like lots of objections, like why would you be asking them questions? But questions can do all sorts of things. One of the things they can do is to clear up bad theology. So I think often people reject the idea of God because they've got this image of God in their head who's like a strict head teacher, or maybe like a vindictive kid with a magnifying glass and an ant sort of trying to figure out who they're going to burn and who they're going to save. And I think this is summed up by Richard Dawkins, the famous atheist, who said that actually the God of the Old Testament is the most unpleasant character in all fiction. most unpleasant character in all fiction. And I think so many of my friends think that if God did exist, that he wouldn't like them. There's absolutely no knowledge of the God that we believe in, the God who would do anything to do everything to reconcile the world to himself. And so I think actually part of us asking questions is to show our friends and our family that actually we also don't believe in the God that they don't believe in. And the God that they don't believe in is not the God of the Bible. So they can help to sort of clear up bad theology. Questions can also find out what people believe. That sounds so obvious, but I don't know, maybe this is just me, but I so often assume that I know what people think about something without ever stopping to ask them. And also this may just be my situation, but so many of my friends and family who know that I'm a Christian, they think that I've got a faith position and they don't. And I think this is such an important point to make, that actually no one starts from neutral. No one is neutral. It's not that I've got a faith position and they don't. We all come from a faith position, even if that's no faith, and we will bring that non-neutral position into all of our interactions. And people's beliefs can be informed by all sorts of things, by their upbringing, by their friends, by what they read, often online. There are some things that it might be worth sort of looking into, which is the common worldviews. And when I say the word worldview, I just mean the way in which people view the world. And again, on that sheet that's hopefully going to be sort of circulated afterwards, that resource sheet, there is some helpful information about finding out a little bit more about what other worldviews, excuse me, what other worldviews think. But people's worldviews are also influenced by culture. And I think you know, we live in a culture that is sort of consumer focused. It's focused on what we can sort of get out of situations and experiences. It's a culture which is saturated with information at the click of a button. And we need to be aware that so many people will have got their opinions online. And I think it's fair to say that it's really difficult to differentiate between credible academic content and absolute nonsense online. So we need to be aware that people might have read slightly strange things, and that's kind of what they're coming to us with. It's a culture that's always switched on, that's desperate to avoid FOMO. It's a culture that says that all opinions are equally valid. And it's a culture which, as we've already seen, is hiding behind a filter. So that's kind of the culture that people are coming in with, the worldview that people have already got with them, even when they say that they're coming from neutral. And there's a great verse in 1 Chronicles 12, verse 32, that says, the men of Issachar who understood the times and they knew what Israel should do. The men of Issachar who understood the times and knew what Israel should do. And I think in a similar way, we need to learn to understand the times, to understand our culture, to listen to what culture's saying, but importantly, to speak into it. Don't know whether you know Governor B, the rapper. He's written, his first book was called Unpopular Culture. And it was written sort of predominantly for teenagers, but it's such a great quote. I'm going to read it because I think it's relevant for everyone. It's time for us to surprise the world. God wants to use you, and he has a purpose for you to influence the culture. Don't settle for how things currently are, and don't let others dictate how and what you should be. We can be part of God's plan to bring hope to a hopeless generation. Let's flip the script, demonstrate another way to live, and find freedom in going against the grain. I love that. Let's find freedom in going against the grain. So we can be ready by beginning to understand people's worldviews, what they think about things. But I also think it's really important that we show them that there's a better story, that we sort of get in on their worldview and show them that there's something better. And Revelation 12, verse 11 says that we will overcome by the blood of the Lamb and by the word of our testimony. We know, don't we, that God's story is powerful. We overcome by the blood of the Lamb. But I also think our testimonies are really powerful, and actually our own experiences will really impact those who know us. This is something that I think maybe we should be doing over the next few weeks. You might want to sort of jot it down now, but let's certainly sort of commit to doing this over the next few weeks. I'm basically just speaking to myself here, but I think a really good habit for us to do at the end of each week, possibly at the end of each day, but certainly at the end of each week, is just to kind of reflect on the week and try and jot down some of those God moments. So the moments where we've seen answered prayer, where we've seen God maybe saying something to us, where even we felt the most sort of peace that doesn't make sense, where logically we shouldn't be feeling peace in that situation, and just write down some of those moments, because I think when there's those sort of God moments are at the forefront of our mind, they're going to be much easier to then share with our friends and our family if those opportunities arise, to be able to share what God has done in our own life, because actually I think our testimony is so powerful. So yeah, questions help us to find out what people think. They also put the ball back into our friends and our family's court. So I think so many people, and I think rightly so, want us to defend our beliefs. They want to know what we think and why, and we should be ready to defend our beliefs. But I also think if we then ask questions, that puts the emphasis back on them to defend their beliefs as well, to think about why they believe what they believe. So for example, if someone says to you, and this question will often come up with Muslims, if someone says to you that the Bible's not reliable, perhaps because it's been changed lots of times, or they might have other reasons, you could sort of respond with a whole bunch of facts, and the fact that that there's been a really short line between when the event happened and when it was written down, so it was 3 to 30 years, or the fact that we have like an unprecedented amount of manuscripts in existence, 24,000 compared to much smaller numbers of other historical documents. Or so you could reply with all those facts, or you could simply just sort of ask them a question back and say, oh, that's really interesting. Why don't you think the Bible's reliable? Is there a particular thing that's stopping you from thinking that it's trustworthy? Why do you think it's been changed? Because actually you can then get to the specifics of what someone's struggling with, and you can begin to sort of work with them, particularly around where their issues are. And the guy who hosts Unbelievable most of the time, a guy called Justin Riley, will often ask a non-Christian guest on our show, what would it take for you to believe in God? Which is a big question. And obviously you've got to be in a good relationship with someone to ask them about it like that. What would it take for you to believe in God? But I think that's such an interesting question, because it kind of pinpoints the specific objection that someone has. And I think even more importantly than that, it brings us back to the heart of the gospel. It stops us kind of skirting around the periphery issues that maybe aren't an issue for them, but it gets to the heart of the question of what they're struggling with. And most importantly, questions show that we care. I think, when we're asking questions, instead of bombarding people with our ready-made kind of perfect answers, we're showing people that their opinions matter, that we care about what they think. So we can be ready by asking people questions to see where they're at, but we can also encourage questions. So before we go to looking at encouraging questions, I'm going to get you to just spend a couple of minutes thinking about what are some of the big questions that your friends and families have. Like, what are some of the big objections that come up? Are they the same questions that are coming up time and time again, or is it have lots of people got lots of different questions? Maybe just take a couple of minutes to sort of write down some of those, and feel free to write some of them in the chat. I'm just going to have a look through some of your comments, because I saw a few comments coming in there, and then we'll just have a look at encouraging questions. Cool. There's some great questions coming in. Thank you so much. I might come back to some of these at the end, because I think it'd be good to spend a chunk of time talking about these. So I will just park some of those questions, but I do think it's really helpful. I quite often do this. Just to think about, like, what are some of the questions that people have got, and are they the same questions that come up time and time again, or is it something new? And often something like a pandemic will sort of bring up new questions. And I think the obvious question that's kind of come up a lot in the pandemic is suffering, and why God would let something like this happen. But I think one of the other big questions that has come up is the question of the horrific injustice and racism that we've seen embedded in our culture, that came up particularly in light of all the George Floyd things and the Black Lives Matter debates, protests, and all of that. And I think it's really, these are such important questions, because 25% of under 10s in the UK are Black, Asian or minority ethnic. So this is such a big thing. And I would imagine that it's probably a question that will come up, particularly if we're talking to young people, because it's really at the forefront of their minds. Why would God let injustice like this happen. And whenever I'm speaking about something like this, I think it's really important that I say that I'm so aware of my white privilege, and so unaware of the deep suffering of so many non-white people who encounter that every single day. So I think that's the first thing to say, is that like we've got to be aware of the privilege that we come from, if we come from a position of privilege. But one of the questions I think that's so tied up in all of that as well is Christianity a white man's religion or a white person's religion? Because what we've seen recently is so many young Black Christians turn away from the gospel, and particularly because of a misrepresentation of the gospel. And a lot of these have turned actually to Islam. So there was an article in Christianity Today, which is an American publication, which suggested that the majority of Islamic converts were 85 to 90% of them, the US converts to Islam, were Black, which is so interesting. And actually a huge proportion of them were Christians as well before they became Muslims. And that totally resonates actually with a guy who I interviewed, who actually is in a UK context, a guy called Yemi, who he grew up in a church in the UK, and he had so many questions, but basically he was never really allowed to ask them in his church context. You know, it was kind of the, oh, just have faith, don't worry about your questions, park your head at the door, that kind of thing. And he sort of really struggled with these questions. And a lot of his friends basically began to sort of investigate Islam. And he found that a lot of them had their questions answered by Islam. So he started going to a mosque, and the imams basically spent hours sort of sitting with him and answering his questions. And even if they couldn't sort of answer them the way he wanted, they would just sort of sit and wrestle with his questions with him. Now, Yemi did eventually find his way back to Jesus through apologetics, actually. But I think that's such a challenging reminder to us that actually our homes, our friendship groups, our churches, whatever that looks like at the moment, whether that's kind of online or a hybrid, they've got to be safe places where no question is off limits, where doubts are allowed, where objections are allowed to be raised. I think particularly when we're dealing with young people, they've got to know that it's a safe place to ask questions. So I've got, again, some resources on that list, that magic list that I've been talking about, around those questions of whether sort of Christianity is racist, injustice, all of that. There's some amazing people doing amazing things. So do check out some of those resources. But I say all this just to say that actually we've got to encourage people to ask us questions, to deal with their difficult objections, to test what we say. And so we've got to be ready. We've got to equip ourselves. But we also, like, one thing that we can do is know where to point them as well. If we're not equipped to answer it ourselves, to point them to brilliant people doing brilliant things. But I think this is really important. And if you don't hear anything else I say in the whole webinar, please hear me when I say this, that even the best apologists in the world do not know all of the answers. And that's okay. I think it's really important that we are humble enough and aware enough of our own sort of inadequacy to say, I don't know. And that's okay. So John Lennox, who I'm sure lots of you have come across, Professor John Lennox, he's the emeritus maths professor at Oxford University, and he's an absolute wizard at answering so many difficult questions. But he says that actually saying I don't know is really powerful, because it shows that we're on the same level as the people who are asking those questions. And recently I went on holiday with a friend, and she'd just come out of a really, really painful relationship breakdown. And the whole way back from the holiday, we sort of got delayed at the airport. And the whole way back, this was back when you could fly, back when you could go on holiday before the pandemic. We spent the whole journey back sort of talking about how God could exist when he let bad things like that happen. And so we spent kind of hours talking about the different worldviews, approaches to suffering, so that in an atheist perspective, that, you know, the idea that suffering is kind of just part of life, that even to ask the question why is to put meaning on a meaningless and random world. And then we looked at the kind of the Eastern religion perspective, that actually the cause of suffering, of our suffering, is because we've got too attached to the world. And obviously that idea of reincarnation, that it sort of keeps going round and round and round. And when really the only way to avoid that is to detach ourselves from the world and to reach for sort of nirvana, which literally that word means extinction. And then we looked at the Islamic perspective, the idea that actually we're suffering because Allah willed it, and he's the only person powerful enough to take away our suffering. But if he's willed it, then actually to question that is blasphemy. So really our solution, or all of our only solution, is to submit to Allah's will, but to sort of pray in mercy that he will have mercy on us and take away the suffering. And then we sort of talked about the Judeo-Christian worldview in contrast to all of that, the idea that actually suffering is really real, but it's also really wrong, that it was never life as God intended, as Yahweh intended, that he created the world good and perfect, but that actually suffering came because we rejected God's perfect will for our lives. And it was when we began to say no, that's when the suffering began to creep in. That's when stuff began to get really broken, not just in our own lives, but kind of in creation and the natural order of things, that we began to see the brokenness. So we talked about the different kind of worldviews perspective on suffering. And then, because we had loads of time, we talked through the sort of Christian response to that and looked at Jesus's life, his death and his resurrection. So looking at his life, sort of focusing in on that verse in John 11:33, where Jesus is at Lazarus's tomb, and John 11:33 is often translated Jesus wept, but actually if you look back at the Greek word, the literal translation doesn't really mean weep. It means Jesus snorted in anger. Jesus wasn't just upset, he was raging. He was so angry. Not only was he kind of experiencing that intimate human emotion, but actually there's something much deeper going on. He was angry because he knew that the world shouldn't be like this. It wasn't meant to be like this, and it's not going to be like that forever. We also looked at Jesus' death, the idea that we worship a God with nail-scarred hands, who's ultimately a God of love, who laid down his life to restore a relationship that we ourselves had broken with God through our own rebellion. So we looked at his life, we looked at his death, and then we looked at his resurrection, the idea that actually if Jesus raised from the dead, and I think we even looked at sort of some of the proofs of the resurrection, but if Jesus raised from the dead, then actually death isn't the end. This isn't the end of the story. And we looked at that incredible verse in Revelation 21 verse 4, which promises that God himself, his own hand, will wipe away our tears. And because as Christians, we have that firm hope, as it says in Lord of the Rings, that everything sad will one day be untrue. So we talked about all of those things. We talked about the different worldviews, approaches to suffering. We talked about Jesus' life, his death and his resurrection. But then what I did was I sort of shared something which she knew because it had happened fairly recently, which was that one of my friends who I'd been ardently praying for just before we'd come on holiday had tragically died of cancer. And I just sort of said to her, look, I might know some of the reasons why these things might happen, you know, why we've got suffering, but actually I don't know. I don't know why God didn't save my friend. I don't know why my prayers weren't answered. But what I do know is that somehow, in a way that just completely doesn't make sense, I have this peace in the midst of what should just be an absolutely tragic situation. And I kind of talked about the fact that when a kid falls over and is crying and has, you know, got a bloody knee, we don't go over to them and tell them why they fell over and you know, that the blood, the red stuff on their knee is blood. We scoop them up and we give them a cuddle. And actually I said to my friend that I think that's a little bit like what happens at the incarnation, that the God of time and space sort of broke into this messy world to pick us up and to hold us and to be with us and to and to live a sort of earthly life and show us that he understands, even if we don't exactly know why we're suffering, even if there's no neat answers, even if we don't know why. And it was really interesting. My friend said she's got lots of Christian friends, and she said that she was so fed up with Christians who kind of had all these perfect answers, and she loved the fact that I said I didn't know. And quite frankly, I definitely could have saved myself hours by just being humble enough to say I don't know at the beginning. But I think it really taught me that actually it's okay to say I don't know, and we've got to humble ourselves and admit that we don't know all of the answers. And interestingly, I was reading Job this morning, and one of the verses that popped out to me, Job 13 verse 5, which just says, Job's saying this to his friends who are giving him like pat answers constantly: if only you would be altogether silent, for you that would be wisdom. And I think actually there is such wisdom sometimes in just being silent, or admitting that we don't know, or maybe asking if we can find those answers together to go on that journey, to find the answers to the difficult questions that they've got, all the while kind of praying that actually, even if they don't find their answers, even if they don't find the specific reasons for the objections that they have, that perhaps in the midst of it, they will find God anyway. So worship Christ as Lord of your life. And if someone asks about your hope as a believer, always be ready to explain it. And we get to the final part of that verse, which says, but do this in a gentle and respectful way. I think it's really important to say that nothing we will say to our friends and family will probably be as powerful as the way that we act towards them. And that's really difficult, obviously, in a pandemic when we're probably not seeing a lot of our friends and family in person. But just that willingness to be there when our friends are struggling, that openness to questions, you know, the fact that we might just always be there at the end of the phone and they know that can be so powerful. We need to remember that this is not an intellectual issue. It's not an intellectual exercise. People are not asking these questions from a purely intellectual perspective. There's often real emotion behind the questions that people have. There's often negative experiences that are tied up in all of that. So we have got to absolutely have compassion and deep love for our friends. We need to remember that we're not trying to win arguments. We're trying to point people to the God who passionately loves them. That is our end point, not to win an argument. We need to be gentle. We need to be respectful. And we need to be willing to lose an argument to win that person. I love what J. John says. He says, people don't care how much we know until they know how much we care. I think that's really important. We need to show people how much we care about them, that actually that's much more important than the things that we think we know, the kind of answers that we can rattle off. And so as we head into this new year, let's prioritize our own relationship. Worship Christ as Lord of our life. Let's remember why we do this, why we want to share this hope with our friends, with our family. And let's pray for our relationships, for those people that you maybe jotted down near the beginning, for the people that you're sort of going to intentionally be praying for and investing in throughout the year. Because I think actually when we're constantly praying for people, it also takes the pressure off us, because we remember that it's absolutely not our responsibility. It's God's responsibility to change hearts. We just get to partner with him in this. Let's spend this new year asking the Spirit for insight into our friends and our families' lives, to soften their hearts, to give us wisdom, courage, gentleness, to speak the right words in season. I want to end, and then we'll answer some of your brilliant questions, with a story from my friend Vince, who Dr. Vince Vitale is a brilliant philosopher, and he was doing a university mission, and he's really organised, so he planned his talk way in advance, but he was just praying about the talk and sort of asking for wisdom, and he felt really strongly like he needed to add something into his talk. So he sort of went back to his room, added an extra PowerPoint slide and sort of tweaked his talk slightly. Then he went down to the lecture room ready to give his talk. Lots of students piled in, and this one student, Chinese student, walked in, and one of the team welcomed her and asked what her name was, and she said that her name was Alva, and she went on to explain that her name meant by grace washed white as snow. And Alva wasn't a Christian, but the team member who welcomed her said to her, oh, that's really interesting, like your name by grace washed white as snow is right at the heart of the gospel. So they sort of chatted a little bit more, and then they sat down, and Vince started his talk. And then he got to the slide that he had added just at the last minute. And that verse, the slide was a Bible verse, Isaiah 1 verse 18, which says, though your sins are like scarlet, I will make them white as snow. And Alva was just completely taken aback. Though your sins are like scarlet, they should be white as snow. Literally her name right there on the screen. And the team had the immense privilege of praying for Alva to become a Christian. So I tell you that just to remind you that we're not dealing with projects, we're dealing with people. People like Alva, people like Jim, people like the lady that I was saying that I interviewed just before Christmas, who became a Christian in the pandemic. So we'll have a chance to pray at the end, and what I'd love to do is just pray for all the people that you're sort of thinking about and praying about. But let's have some questions. I'm just going to scroll back. So Rupert's had a couple of really good questions. One of the questions you had, Rupert, was I can't actually read my writing, so I'm going to find your original question, because I've scrolled down your question but I can't read what I said. Oh, have you had any difficult confrontations? Yeah. Yeah, for sure. I think I've had loads of difficult confrontations, and I think anyone who does any sort of evangelism in any kind of context will have had difficult confrontations. But I genuinely think, taking in context that that final part of the verse, like be gentle and respectful, I think if we're being gentle and we're being respectful, those difficult confrontations, they're going to be one-sided effectively, because actually I think the more loving you are, the more compassionate you are, it's actually really disarming. And people generally, if they're sort of quite confrontational, they're sort of looking for a fight, and if you're not going to give them a fight, then they'll often back down. And often what I found is people who are sort of really in some ways, I find apathetic people much harder to talk to, because people who are quite confrontational and quite angry, there's often a reason they're like that, and they've really thought about this stuff. And so if you kind of get to the heart of why they're angry and why they're struggling with these things, you can have amazing conversations. So actually, yeah, I have had some encounters with people who are confrontational, but normally it sort of works out okay. Yeah, sadly, others sometimes see us hypocritical by saying one thing and not living up to the standard. How do you best deal with this? Yeah, do you know, that's so true. And I really struggled with this actually as a teenager. I remember at school, you know, saying one thing and everyone knew I went to see you and stuff, and then you'd like mess up a pie or whatever. But I do think honesty again is the best way of dealing with this. Again, some of the most powerful conversations I've had with people is my non-Christian friends, where I've sort of gone and said, I'm so sorry, I shouldn't have done that. Like, I shouldn't have hurt you like that. I shouldn't have said that. I shouldn't have done that. And you need to know that I'm not perfect. I'm a work in progress. And I think what a lot of my friends think is because you're a Christian, you're never going to swear, or you're never going to do whatever. But actually to say, you know, I'm still working this thing out, but actually that's what grace is. That's the heart of the gospel, is that God loves me anyway, that he loves me too much to leave me the way I am. But yeah, I'm not finished yet. This isn't the end of the story. He can, of course, use my brokenness, turn it into beauty like kintsugi. But yeah, I'm not finished yet, which sort of encourages them as well, because a lot of my friends think that they need to be perfect to kind of become a Christian, but actually it's like completely the other way around. So, and let's just see, what were the other questions? Oh yeah, Sahara's made an amazing point there. Sometimes I find deep down that it's not the facts that they really want. The facts alone often aren't enough, but the gospel of Jesus Christ is truly transformative. Yeah, absolutely. I've had so many interactions, particularly with young people, where they like, it looks like they've got loads of sort of intellectual objections, like often quite kind of technical stuff about like God and science and things like that. And we'll gently sort of go through some of those questions. But what I often find is that actually deep down, it's not those questions that are an issue at all. What it boils down to is, you know, their mum died when they were younger or whatever, and so they have this huge kind of emotional objection to God. And so sometimes, again, that's when it comes back to asking people questions, to really try and find out the heart of like what is like the question behind the question of it. Like often it's not just the question that they're asking, there's sometimes something behind that. Don't know whether anyone else has any other questions. Just trying to see. Probably put my glasses on, that might help actually. You might be able to actually see what people are saying. Do you think it's worth asking that God will stir some of these big questions in people? Is the head into it? Yeah, that's again, Richard, such a great question. I do think it's worth, sorry, so Richard's question is it worth asking that God will stir some of these big questions in people? And I do think that's a great question, actually. It feels kind of harsh, doesn't it, asking God to like put questions in people's hearts? But again, it kind of comes back to what I was saying, that actually I think some people are really apathetic and don't have questions. And that's where us asking them questions can be quite helpful. And often sort of things being triggered in their lives, often something like a pandemic, which again, I'm not in any way justifying that. I don't think that's the right thing to do, but sometimes things like that can trigger questions. So yeah, I do think it's great to ask God to put questions in people's hearts. That does, however, mean that we need to be prepared, or at least prepared to sort of walk with people through their questions and to say, I don't know. Often we get questions which we feel we can't answer. What are some of the things we can say so that we can still encourage the person, that we don't have a specific answer? Yeah, great question. So what if we don't know the answer to that question? I think the first thing is just to be honest and say, I don't know. But also there are some really great resources on that document. Like obviously there's way smart people out there. So I think sort of showing people those smart people, but I think, like I said before, like doing it with them rather than just saying, oh, there's this book you can read, there's this YouTube video. Why don't you, again, it's difficult to do in a pandemic, but perhaps say, why don't we watch this video together? And then we can, you know, if you've got any other questions, we can talk about it together. But I think as well, sharing your own experiences. So it comes back to kind of what we're saying about testimony. Like, here are some things you can say, here are some answers, here are some articles, but actually I still don't know the answer to that question, and here's how I reconcile it in my own life. You know, there's some difficult passages in the Bible, but for me the kind of overarching thing is a God of love and things like that. So I guess like talking about your own experience, how do you there'll be some questions for sure that we've never even thought of, that some people are asking us that we haven't thought of, but it's a huge issue for them. I think they're harder, but there will undoubtedly be tons of questions that we have thought about, and maybe we don't have a perfect answer for it, but we've learned to kind of live with that tension. So I think just being honest with them about how we've learned to live with that tension and how we can reconcile, that is really helpful. You got any advice on how to lovingly agree to disagree? Brilliant question. I think you just agree to disagree. That feels like I'm totally fobbing you off, but I think I have got so many friends who have completely different opinions to me, but we still get on really, really well. And I think as well, if people know that you have really deep convictions, they really respect that, even if they completely disagree with you. And I think it comes back to like your approach. It's about being really loving, really compassionate with it, not sort of trying to shove your message down their throat constantly. And I think, if people think that you're completely wrong about what you believe, but you're so loving and so compassionate and always there for them, like actually it comes back to what I was saying about often the way we act will be more powerful than necessarily just what we say. And again, it's about kind of living a provocative life. So that Bonhoeffer thing of the way that we live our life should cause non-believers to question their disbelief in God. Like actually, if we're living such hope-filled lives, why would they not want a piece of that? Even if kind of intellectually they can't necessarily reconcile everything that you believe in. Other question, do you sometimes feel threatened as a vulnerable female? Oh, it's a great question. I wish I could talk to you in person, because I'm wondering whether you're talking about the kind of like women shouldn't speak in church side of stuff, which there's a whole thing. And actually there's some great resources on that sheet around, amazing women in the Bible and things like that. But I'm assuming you mean in a kind of confrontational setting, maybe, where, so the area that I work in, apologetics, is very, very male dominated, and lots of sort of white middle-aged men mainly. So I do often feel like I'm the token woman, but I think actually I know that I'm not there on my own strength. Like sure, I've got a theology degree, but that's not why I'm there. I'm there because God has put me there. And so I think so often when we humble ourselves and acknowledge our weakness, that's when God can be strong through us. I mean, that's a fully biblical principle, isn't it? That God uses the weak and the not wise in the world to sort of shame the strong. And so I think actually often God can use a tiny little child to speak incredible wisdom to a professor. So yeah. Okay, I think that's all of the questions, unless let me just see if there's anything else in the chat. No, cool, that is all of the questions. So what I might quickly do is I'll just quickly pray, because that feels like a really good thing to do. Hopefully you've all managed to get that document, because there's some really helpful stuff from some way smart people. So let's just pray. And I think the most important thing is for us to just commit those people that we've been thinking about and praying about to God, because there's nothing we can do in those situations. God, thank you so much that your hands are big enough, that you are so much smarter and bigger and greater than we could ever be. But God, we have the immense privilege of being able to partner with you in this, and we want to thank you so much for that incredible opportunity. And God, I just ask that you will equip us to be able to do that, that you will give us wisdom way beyond our years, not for our own glory, but for yours. God, that any words you give us will just point straight to you. And I just ask that you will lift up all of the friends and family members that we're thinking of right now, that you will soften their hearts, that you will unblock their ears, that scales will fall from their eyes. And God, that they will see you as we see you, that they will come to know that you are the God of hope. God, they will know the truth of that incredible verse in Zephaniah 3:17, that you are rejoicing over them with singing. And we ask all this knowing that you are the God of the prodigals that is desperate to see all your children come home. Amen. Cool. We have got a minute to spare, so I'm going to let you go and get a cup of tea, because that feels like a good thing to do at 4 o'clock. Thank you so much, guys.